Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Book Club. Today is a very special book club. I find it almost impossible to choose a favorite book. I feel like it's like saying who your favorite child is, but it is entirely possible that if someone has asked me what my favorite book is, I have answered with The Lover. A little bit about Duras. She was a French novelist, playwright, screenwriter, essayist, and experimental filmmaker. Now, I've been holding out on doing this book because it is so special and meaningful to me. And now I'm very glad I did because our guest today could not be more perfect. Olivia is an artist and literary translator. Her latest translation is The Easy Life, published in 2022. She currently lives in Catalonia, Spain, which is where we will be talking to her from. I couldn't be more excited for this conversation. Truly is one of my favorite books. While I could do an extensive book club on just the themes of The Lover itself, I wanted to do things a little bit different today. Olivia and I are going to talk about all of this through the art of translation. Now, without further ado, let's talk to Olivia.
Hi.
I'm so excited for this.
Me too.
You are the book club's first translator. How did you become a literary translator?
So I did not think I was going to translate in my life, really, even though I've always grown up with languages. Because I grew up bilingual, native bilingual with French and English, but then I also lived in Spain, and so I spoke Spanish and Catalan. But I was always interested in writing. And then when I went to university, much later, I went to obviously I learned these languages as a kid, and then I went to the American University of Paris.
Yeah.
And I studied comparative literature. That's where I was actually introduced to Duras. It felt just right to continue my studies and do an MA in cultural translation. It was all my same professors. So a lot of it was like, I don't really want to leave. I adore these people. I want to keep learning with them. It was either that or doing an MFA in writing at Goldsmiths in London. And there was something about my writing, because I do write, and there was something about my writing that had always been a bit of translation, because I'd always moved around, and so I always felt like I was translating myself from French, kind of. And so I was like, I think this would be really interesting.
What languages do you translate and work with now, and how many languages do you speak?
I speak 4 languages. Fluently: French, English, Spanish, and Catalan. Catalan I just recuperated for the last 3 years. I had it as a kid, lost it, got it back. And then I only really professionally translate from French to English. But I've done English to French, and now I'm starting to do some Spanish and Catalan to English.
Okay.
But let's say the most natural has always been French to English, because those are like my native languages.
Now, is there a common misunderstanding of what translators actually do? Because I feel like we've all had moments of copy and pasting something into Google Translate and it gives you a response that is not the intention of whoever said it or wrote it. So how do you describe the art of translation to those who don't understand the multitudes it contains?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, Google Translate makes it look so easy. And then you see that it's actually not working when it's that easy. So the thing about translation is there's a lot of what people don't realize maybe is that it's a very strange practice in a lot of ways, because there's this element of, I always think of it a little bit like acting too. Like there's this element of you getting, especially if you're doing literary translation, of you getting into the skin of the author and sort of having to embody the author and almost write the text a second time, which is almost spiritual. Like there's no really, I know that you have with acting, you don't really know what happens when you become a character. It's the same with translation. It's like, how do you actually meet the author at the moment they wrote the text so that you can actually write it a second time? So there's this element of kind of having to let go, but at the same time, you also are controlling so much of what you're doing. You're thinking so hard about your choices. It's not just looking at the dictionary and thinking, okay, this word means this. No, there's so many layers to all of it.
There's so much writing on translation, particularly when you're working with people like Duras. Are you ever afraid of stripping the essence of her work when translating? Like, how do you keep someone like Duras?
Well, so I co-translate her with my co-translator and also my great friend, Emma Ramadan. We did the masters together. That's how we started translating her together. over our shared obsession with her. And that is like our number one worry. We always are very worried of stripping her of that feeling, because for us, the most important thing about Duras is not necessarily what the words mean on the page, but how the text makes you feel as you read it as a whole, and sort of as you're moving through it. And so I think, yes, like absolutely, we're very afraid of that as we're doing it. But that's also, there's like this element of just, we have to let go into it and trust her rhythm, and really trust that if we follow her rhythm, we will get to her voice. And it's interesting because we're also co-translators. So obviously, you know, although I think that we read her in a very similar way, we're two different individuals. So there's also this thing of us having to like regroup at the end of every draft, individual draft, and sort of merge our own voices into the voice of Duras.
I mean, and that's the incredible thing about literature, and particularly Duras, I think, because she doesn't write in a very conventional way. There's a lot of dialogue that isn't necessarily clarified by punctuation, and you find yourself getting lost in the rhythm of it. You know, I've given this book to so many people and everyone has a different relationship to it. I know that like you've also translated Me and Other Writing, which is one of my favorite pieces of her work as well, and The Easy Life, and you're talking a lot about the rhythm of Duras, which is easy to get swept into in reading her. How do you approach translating some of those chaotic and melodic sentences to elicit that same feeling in the reader?
So first of all, I feel like translation, another thing I will say is that it's the closest reading you can ever have of a text, which is sort of why I wanted to translate Duras in the first place, because I feel like it's like the most up close and personal you will ever get to that author and that text, you know? I think especially in those passages which feel like if you isolate them in translation as you're like looking at them just as a sentence, you're like, what does this actually mean? I'm lost, you know? And so this happens to Emma and I often, where if we isolate these sentences from the whole, we're like, we don't really even know how to approach this sentence. So there's a moment where we just have to like let go and almost translate as if we're writing. I wouldn't know how to really even describe that, because it's like, it's very difficult to do. It's almost like you just have to like read a passage and then just like try to write it a second time in English. But then what really helps is that we speak it aloud, both to ourselves, and then we have these Zoom calls where we will like speak our drafts aloud to each other. And whenever something sounds a little off, we have like the co-translator who's like, oh, wait a second, that sounds a little off to me. Like, and then Emma, for example, like we have different personalities in translation. So like I tend to love when something doesn't make sense. Like I'm like, oh, this is great. Like it just makes no sense. And she's like, okay, but like it should make a little bit of sense. And I'm like, okay, so let's meet in the middle somewhere. So we start to sort of like get back to Duras's voice. And honestly, I think sometimes Duras didn't know what she was saying. I think we, even as people, you know, like I think we say things and we don't have the absolute truth of what we are saying.
Do you ever find yourself, especially because you work with a co-translator, do you find yourself getting stuck on a word or a sentence? And how do you settle on something that feels closest to the truth in these moments? Like, do you feel like they tend to be more matters of the head or of the heart?
It's like we weigh them out. It's sometimes it's a bit of a battle. I didn't want to bring astrology into this talk, but I'm a Gemini and she's a Virgo. So we're kind of like, I'm just like, let's go with the flow. And she's like, let's understand what we were talking about.
I am a Virgo. So I'm like stick to the facts, organized, like it makes sense.
Honestly, what's really interesting about co-translating in those moments is that our conversations become so interesting regarding like the language she's using and what exactly this article is doing in the French that it can't do in the English. There's just like very specific grammar things and syntax things that we end up having to kind of like nitpick over. But I think most of the time it's a matter of the heart. Like when we hear the sentence after we've sort of like picked out little areas we want to change, and we're like, this is Duras. Like, this is no longer how Emma sees it, or this is no longer how I see it. Like, this is Duras. So it's really just, if you feel it, that's her, you know? And it's hard to explain.
And I think it actually does Duras a disservice to try and over-intellectualize her work. One of my favorite and most hilarious quotes of hers about The Lover is when she described the book as a load of shit. She said in an interview, it's an airport novel. I wrote it when I was drunk. And yet it's become a modern classic. Like it won one of France's most prestigious literary prizes and was made into a film, which she also then later discredited and then wrote another book that she claimed was better to kind of mess with the director of that film. Knowing her so intimately and working with her the way that you do, why do you think she disregarded this particular book?
So I've thought a lot about this because I just reread it for our talk. I hadn't read it in like 10 years. It's interesting because as I was reading it, and I'm like curious if you maybe felt this or not. So I read this interview at the back of the French copy I got, which is like this kind of nifty copy, like hardcover. It's really interesting because she's like, yeah, actually this book was supposed to be called The Absolute Image. It was supposed to be this text that sort of was with a photo album that she had found of photos of her youth. And it's funny because when I read it, I was, because it's so disjointed. It's like all these different moments in her life sort of like collated.
Yeah.
And I was reading it and I was like, this kind of reminds me of Instagram. Almost like every paragraph is like a post. Also, the way she's describing her image and how she's like very obsessed with this hat and these shoes she's wearing and how she's like presenting herself as a 15-year-old. And I was reading it and I was like, it has that same kind of like feel as Instagram does, where it's like snapshots and you're sort of like remembering things based on these images. Also, there's this thing about the book where maybe this is why she's like, it's a load of shit. I really feel like it's the most accessible of her books in some sense. I don't know if you agree with that, but there's actually this quote that I think I should read because it's like what she said about this book. And I think it kind of like speaks to what you're asking me, but she's like, I understood later that it was not the current me who had nurtured the book, nor found the order of how it unfolded, but someone in me, someone I thought I no longer knew and who I had allowed to run free with it. To tell you the truth, I don't think there are any great novels nor true novels that are outside of the self. I'm the story. I am. Like, I think that it's the 15-year-old her who wrote that book. It's not her as a 70-year-old woman. Like, it's an adolescent book in a lot of senses.
And it's so interesting that she wrote it, later on in life, because I also feel like this is a lot of people's introduction to her work. What was the first piece of her writing that you read?
So I read, actually, it wasn't The Lover. It was The Ravishing of Lil Stein. They take out the English title, which is in my obsession, I was gonna say, in my opinion, a much less accessible book than The Lover. It's like much more kind of, I don't know, it's funny because it's like an earlier book of hers, but it feels less accessible. It profoundly like shook me to my core. It's the reason that I read and wanted to translate her and everything. But yeah, I think that The Lover in some sense is like, maybe that's why she kind of wanted to write it off and was like, it's an airport novel, because it's just it's a bunch of like snapshots from her youth, and obviously it's explored in depth because that's what she does, is she gets to like the underbelly of everything, but it still is written almost by her inner 15-year-old girl.
I agree. Like reading it again, in preparation for this, I had such a different reaction to it, and so with the scatteredness, and I had read it for the first time when I was like 16, so of course had a very different relationship to it. Do you feel like your relationship to this book has changed since the last time you read it was 10 years ago?
I think so. Actually, it's funny because I think when I first read it, I don't know about you or how you received it, but I think for me what was really incredible when I first read it was like I felt very seen, and I felt like less alone in a way, like that someone could put some of the things I maybe had been feeling in my youth or at that time into words. And I think now looking at it 10 years later with, I'm not 70 years old, but I've obviously grown into like a woman, I guess. I felt really touched by it, like looking back sort of at the person who had read it the first time.
My first time reading it, I really read it as a love story. That was the center of it for me. And rereading it over these past couple of days, that did not feel like the central part of the book at all to me. And so it kind of softened me to the version of me that read this as a love story like 7 years ago.
I mean, when you look at it, it really is about what that love story or that desire that she feels, how it empowers her and sort of what it means for her, not what it means for them. And I think what's really interesting about this book, and I noticed it a lot more this time around, there's a lot of passages where she's talking about her kind of this desire that's kind of coming out of her. And she's saying, it's the first time I know that I'm going to be a writer. Like she talks about knowing that she's going to have to write. I don't know, for me, that really touched me because I was like, I think it really has to do with the fact that female desire is, you know, not really accepted. And she's not, she knows that whatever she's feeling now, she can't share with her family. She's going to have to bring it really far away from her family. And she doesn't even want to continue with this man. I mean, it's more about how he makes her feel. That desire that's going to have to be written about kind of in the dark, have a separate life, an independent life of her own.
You know, they were looked down upon for being in this relationship. How much do you think that had to do with the fact of, you know, her being 15 and him being nearly twice her age? And how much do you think was a matter of him being Chinese and her being French?
Well, I don't think we can get out of the colonial context.
Yeah.
Like, we're in French Indochina, like it's a grouping of French colonial territories, and she's white. In this interview, in this book, she says, you know, there are a few books that kind of sparked this book, or sorry, a few words that kind of sparked this book, and one of them is white, because that was sort of what she was in that society and what it meant. And I think there is this kind of power she has like there because she's white, even as a 15-year-old girl. He's Chinese, and that's not well seen by her mother, who, you know, there's obvious racism like running through this book that I think this is kind of like confronting at an older age, but also remembering that she felt super uncomfortable about the whole thing even when she was a teenager. Like how her older brother, who she has a very fraught relationship with, was sort of looking down on this man because he is of a different race. But I think the age obviously had a huge part to play in why it was not accepted. Like, it is shocking. She's 15 years old and she's with I think he's 27. I guess that's not like the focus of the book. It's the whole context of the book, but it's not necessarily, it is one of the focuses, but I think more the focus, again, is just her and how this affair makes her feel and what it's going to give her for the rest of her life, like to come face to face with this side of her that she hadn't yet met, you know, this transition from childhood to adulthood, I guess.
And why do you think this story, and I guess all of her work in general, captivates people, especially young women, to such a, for lack of a better term, culty extent? Duras lovers, myself included, tend to be very obsessive, and, you know, obviously she you connected to her so much that you wanted to work with her writing. What sort of things in her work can you point to that you feel like is nurturing that kind of love and connection to her work?
I think she's fearless. I think that both as a woman, as a person, she was fearless. And I think it's something that really resonates through all of her work and her voice. I think she has a fearless voice. I think she's just not afraid to go where nobody wants to go. And and I think we all seek that, even though, you know, maybe we shy away from some of the controversial topics she touches on. I think that I think that she as a writer wants to go there. Like, she wants to go to like the deepest, darkest places and find out what is behind the surface.
Yes.
And there is like this intensity with all the love stories in every single one of her works. There's this intensity that for me actually is very reminiscent of like adolescence. That's why this book maybe is like the epitome of the Duras romance, because it's the one that started, it's where she comes from. It's her first romance, if you want to call it.
I appreciate so much, and I appreciated it the first time I read it too, the sort of lack of perspective that she gives us. So you really feel like you're experiencing it all with her. It's not like everything in retrospect. It's very much like, this is what was happening in the moment, and maybe I'm not this way now, but so much understanding and space to hold what she was feeling and going through at the time.
For me, I think that's the thing that captivates me most about this novel and all of her writing, is that you experience it along with her. You don't ever feel like you're sort of watching something, like it's not a flashback, you know, those really bad flashbacks in films. Like, you are actually living it like in the moment with her. And I think that she's living it, like she's living everything she writes. She is living it at the same intensity as when it happened the first time.
There's an essay in Me and Other Writing that I think is applicable to The Lover. It's about a man and a young girl who are in love, but not romantically or sexually. In the essay, the man is accused of preying on the younger woman. Duras is suggesting that there are other types of love outside of the societally accepted forms, you know, familial, friendship, romantic, sexual, but that people reject what they don't understand. You know, she's questioning why there's no nuance. And I think that's a big theme in a lot of her books. She's not afraid to have controversial questions on hand. What force do you think drives this exploration in her writing?
I think there's like, okay, a direct parallel with her life and sort of what she lived as a 15-year-old. She lived a taboo relationship where people didn't understand what this was between her and this man. And I think there's like this really kind of maybe recurring pattern that then kind of like she's interested in going where, you know, the taboo areas, like you said, the areas where that are controversial. But she doesn't like things to be tied up in like a neat package and neat words where you're like, oh yeah, you know, like for example, with the essay you're talking about, it's about, I think, this 40-something-year-old man who just becomes, who has this just deep, love, you know, which is very hard to understand for like this girl that is not his daughter, who's, I think, if I remember correctly, is like 10 or something like that. And the girl reciprocates it. Her name is Nadine. I think that for Duras, like this is life. Like this is life is complex. It's mysterious. Like you can't always just like encapsulate it in one little word or one little, you know, you can't put someone in jail because of something that you think is happening when it didn't happen. Like I don't know. She's very in. I think that she's very interested in these areas that can't be explained, and that she wants to kind of probe that and see like what's behind the surface.
Do you feel like working with her writing, you have to fully understand the nuances and those sort of gray areas that Duras explores in order to honestly translate?
No, in a way, because I feel like she doesn't even really understand them. I think she wants them to stay gray. Like she, I think, is really interested in keeping those areas gray. And so I think part of what my job is as her translator, as her co-translator, is to be like, okay, we're keeping this gray. Like we're not
we're not trying to reason this away. Do you find that there are traps in translating things today where, you know, you're translating works from, you know, decades ago? Do you find that there can be a trap in trying to sort of modernize it and maybe soften the blow, looking through it from a cultural lens of today?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think we can do that with her work.
No.
I don't think it's possible. I don't think it would do her, it would just do her a huge disservice. Like I think her whole mission is to kind of like go where no one wants to go. So even though, you know, now there are some places we really can't go, it's like, okay, but she still wants to go there. So I can't stop that. Like, and I think it's necessary. I think to have the full conversation, we sometimes need to go to really uncomfortable places and explore what seems very wrong on the outside, but see what's under the surface, you know, like it's very important.
And it's interesting because she was part of this sort of new wave of French novelists that at the time she wasn't necessarily the most revered. But I think out of all of them, when you look at all of their names, she's been the most lasting and I think is maybe the most recognizable name today.
Absolutely. Like this goes back to your earlier question, but I think people have always been drawn to these problematic gray areas. You know, I think that there's something about what she's exploring, which is somewhat also timeless, like, and universal. And there's these topics are taboo for a reason in many societies because they occur across the globe and through time. So I think that the fact that she wants to tackle them draws people to her.
It is interesting to explore why we as a society are drawn to these taboo stories or stories of forbidden love or bad desire across every language and every culture. You know, for example, how a book like Nabokov's Lolita can become a classic.
Those were some of my favorite novels when I was studying literature. I think if you really want to delve into human nature, which is what I think most people who read, they kind of go there because they want to know perspectives that they wouldn't know otherwise, you know, or they want this kind of light shone back on them into these obscure feelings they don't know how to actually like put into words. I think that, I don't know, I think we need these stories that are going in this no man's land. Like we really need, we need them. We still need them. Like it's really important. We can't just have stories that fall into these boxes. You know, we really need to also still kind of break some boundaries and sort of understand what, I don't know, like even I like to read stories about bad people or whatever, people who are considered evil, because I like to know what led them to evil acts. Like, I like to understand what still makes them human. I think for me, that's one of the most important things about literature, is giving us the two sides of a coin.
And if you could sort of shine the light on a quality in yourself or something about yourself that through Duras you've come to understand, is that something that you can pinpoint?
I think she's very, very obsessed with the image that a woman sort of presents, and that a woman sort of that is received by this gaze that I think is the male gaze. Like, really, I think it's in a lot of her work, and it really speaks to my personal experience, because I'm the daughter of like a photographer and a model who was my dad's muse, and for me, it's been my whole life. It's sort of like the image of the woman in the man's eye. The fact that she explores the gaze in every single one of her novels, this was like a huge territory inside of me that she shone a light on.
Similarly, I grew up with a lot of that deeply ingrained in my DNA. And there's this quote in The Lover that I remember the first time I read it, just like sent chills. And she says, "I know it's not clothes that make women beautiful or otherwise, nor beauty care, nor expensive creams, nor the distinction of costliness of their finery. I know the problem lies elsewhere. I don't know where. I only know it isn't where women think."
Oh my God, I just got the chills.
And it's like that, every time I read that, it becomes more and more true. And I love that she's willing to explore that. And again, without perspective, because she still talks about her hat and her gold lame shoes and her little slip dress. And
Yeah, exactly. That was a really funny thing that I realized this time around reading it, because I had done Me and Other writing, the co-translation of Me and Other writing about 4 or 5 years ago now. And we did an essay on Yves Saint Laurent. I don't know if you remember it, on YSL. And people were like, yeah, but is that really Duras? Like, did she really care about his clothes and all this stuff? They were like, maybe she wrote that for money, or something like that. But I was like, wait a second, like, no, because literally you can just tell in her writing that she's very attuned to the female appearance and how women clothe themselves. And there's this really beautiful response she gives in the interview at the back of this French edition. But she says, "I still remember the first time I realized what the effect that the beauty of a woman had on other people." And she said it was in 1926. So that means she was 12. It was before, The Lover, Duras. And she's like, "I was on a street corner and I saw this woman arrive, and she describes the dress. And I'm like, oh my God, she's using the same language that she did in the Yves Saint Laurent essay. A big preoccupation of hers, like the female image and the way females present themselves, but also are received in the world, and the way that they control their image."
Lastly, if you could suggest one book for anyone watching who hasn't read Duras, what would you recommend first?
So it's not because I co-translated it, but
if it is, it's okay.
The Easy Life by her, which is her second novel, and which in a lot of ways I think is her first novel. She then said, okay, I don't stand by my first novel, which is a different one. And so this second novel for me, The Easy Life, is a great introduction to her, because in a way the protagonist is, for me, the continuation of the 15-year-old Duras in The Lover. So it really is the young Duras. She wrote it when she was 30, and it's a very existential novel, but it has all of the Duras themes as they're like springing up in her writing. So it's basically her finally finding a way to put it all in writing, the way that she was hoping when she's like laying in her lover's bed having the affair.
I haven't even read that one. So, by the way, if I translated a book, I would not shut up about it ever. So I think it's very fair to recommend that one. Thank you so much. This was so, so wonderful. I've been so excited for this. I've been truly holding out on doing any Duras, because I just was like, how can you do it justice? Like, who truly will understand her? And you are truly the perfect person for it. So thank you.
Thank you. This was so great. Bye.
Bye. Thank you everyone for watching. If you haven't already, I could not recommend this book more. Also, there's a wonderful, wonderful interview that she did for the New York Times that I think captures her essence so beautifully and magnificently. So I recommend reading that as well. Thank you everyone, and until next time.